In October of 1927, a group of men stood in a cemetery in Newark, New Jersey, and dug up a woman who had been buried for 5 years. Her name was Molly Maggia. She was 24 when she died. Her death certificate said syphilis. Her family said that was a lie. So the men brought her up out of the ground. And they did something that had never been done before in the history of American law. They took a piece of her. Not for a doctor. Not for a pathologist. They wrapped a fragment of her jawbone in black paper. Completely sealed. No light could reach it, and they laid it on top of an unexposed photographic plate. And they left it in a dark room. Days later, they developed the plate. And there it was. A photograph. Taken in total darkness. By a dead woman's bone. She had exposed the film herself. 5 years in the grave, and Molly Maggia was still bright enough to take her own picture. That image is the reason you have a safe workplace. And here is the part that almost nobody tells you. She is still glowing. Right now. Today. So are the others. Because the thing inside her bones has a half-life of 1600 years, which means the evidence in this case is not in an archive. It is not in a courthouse. It is in the ground in New Jersey and Illinois, and it will still be there long after every person watching this video is gone. This is the story of how a few hundred young women were poisoned by their employer. But that is not really the story. Because being poisoned is not the crime here. The crime is that the company knew. They knew years before the first woman died. They ran the tests themselves. They paid for a study by Harvard scientists. They got the results, and then they took that report, they changed what it said, and they sent the altered version to the state government. That document exists. We know what the real one said. And we know what they replaced it with. So over the next 20 minutes I am going to show you 3 things. I am going to show you exactly what the company was told, and exactly when. I am going to show you how a woman who was too sick to sit upright won a court case from her bed and beat them anyway. And I am going to show you the strangest piece of evidence in this entire story. It is not a document. It is not a witness. It is a measurement taken in 1990-something, from the skeletons of women who died in the 1920s by scientists who were not investigating a crime at all. They were checking whether the numbers still matched. They did. Stay with me. Because the ending of this is not what you think it is. To understand how this happened, you have to understand that radium was not a poison in 1917. Radium was magic. Marie and Pierre Curie had isolated it in 1898, and within 20 years it had become the single most glamorous substance on the planet. It glowed. On its own. Forever, as far as anyone could tell. You did not have to plug it in. You did not have to light it. It just gave off light, out of nothing, and nobody fully understood why. So of course they put it in everything. Radium water. Radium toothpaste. Radium face cream. Radium suppositories. And I want you to sit with that one for a second. There was a health tonic called Radioactive that was literally distilled water with radium dissolved in it, and wealthy men drank it by the case because it was supposed to restore vitality. Radium was priced at more than $100,000 a gram. In 1920s money. It was, by weight, one of the most valuable materials on Earth. And a man named Sabin Arnold von Sochicki figured out what to do with it. He was a physician. Trained in Europe. Brilliant, genuinely brilliant, and completely convinced he was doing something good. He mixed radium with zinc sulfide and glue and made a paint. He called it Undark. Here is why it worked. The radium threw off radiation. The radiation struck the zinc sulfide crystals. And the crystals converted that energy into visible light. Painted on a watch face, and a soldier in a trench could read the time without striking a match and getting his head blown off by a sniper who saw the flare. That is not a small thing. That saved lives. Actual, countable lives. The United States Radium Corporation set up in Orange, New Jersey, and they needed people to apply that paint. The dials were tiny. The numerals were tiny. Some of the watch faces were smaller than a coin, and the lines had to be finer than a hair. So they did not hire chemists. They hired girls. They were mostly between 14 and 20 years old. Immigrant families. Italian, Irish, Polish. Working class Newark and Orange. And this was the best job in town, and I want to be very clear about that, because it is important. This was not a sweatshop that people fled from. The pay was extraordinary. A skilled dial painter could earn 3 times what she would make in a factory, sometimes more, because she was paid per dial and the fast ones were very fast. You could support your family on it. You could buy nice clothes. Girls competed to get in. Sisters brought sisters. Grace Fryer, who is going to matter a great deal later, took the job in 1917, right after America entered the war, and she thought she was helping. And the work was beautiful. That is the part that gets lost. They sat at long tables in daylight, dozens of them, painting numbers onto watch faces with camel hair brushes. It was delicate, skilled work, and they were proud of it. And the paint got everywhere. On their hands, in their hair, on their dresses, in the dust on the floor. So they played with it. They painted their fingernails for a night out. They painted their teeth to surprise a boyfriend in a dark room. One girl painted her eyebrows. Some of them wore their good dresses to work on purpose, so the powder would settle into the fabric, and then they would go dancing. And they would walk into a dance hall and glow. The town called them the Ghost Girls. They thought it was the greatest thing that had ever happened to them. Now here is the specific detail that turns this from an accident into a case. The brushes had to stay sharp. A splayed brush ruins a fine line. So the company taught them a technique. Put the brush between your lips. Twist. Pull it out with a point. Dip it in the paint. Apply. Lip. Dip. Paint. Hundreds of times a day. Some of the women estimated they did it 1,000 times in a shift. Every single time, they swallowed a little bit of radium. And when they asked about it, and some of them did ask, they were told it was harmless. One woman later testified that she was told it would put color in her cheeks. Meanwhile, in the same building on the upper floors, the chemists who handled the raw radium worked behind lead screens. They used tongs. They wore lead aprons. They were monitored. Same company. Same roof. The men who understood the material were shielded from it. The women who put it in their mouths were not told there was anything to shield against. I want to stop here for one moment, because what comes next in this story is the part that most videos skip, and it is the part that actually matters. Everyone tells you the Radium Girls got sick. That is the easy half. The hard half is the paperwork. The suppressed report. The company doctor who was not a doctor. The newspaper advertisement that was published as a lie. That is what I dig for on this channel. Not the legend. The document. If that is what you came for, subscribe, because I release one of these every week, and the next one is already sitting in a folder on my desk. Now let me show you what the company knew. It started in the mouth. It always started in the mouth. In 1922, Molly Maggia had a toothache. Her dentist pulled the tooth. The socket did not heal. It ulcerated. So he pulled the one next to it. That socket did not heal either. Within months, the infection had spread through her jaw, and when her dentist reached into her mouth to examine her, her jawbone came away in his fingers. Not broken. Not cut. It lifted out. In pieces. The radium had been inside her bone, firing radiation outward, for 5 years. Her jaw had been quietly dying the entire time, and there was nothing left holding it together. She died in September of 1922, when the deterioration reached the vessels in her throat and she bled to death. She was 24, and her death certificate said syphilis. Now I have to be careful and precise here, because this is the hinge of the whole story. There was a doctor's diagnosis on that certificate, and in the 1920s, syphilis genuinely did cause bone and tissue destruction, so on paper it was not an insane conclusion for a physician who had never seen radium poisoning, because nobody had ever seen radium poisoning. But look at what that word did. Syphilis, in 1922, was a moral verdict. It said this woman brought this on herself. It said her employer had nothing to do with it. It said her family should be ashamed and should stop asking questions. And it was repeated to other families. As other women started dying the same way, whatever the intent behind the first certificate, the effect was that the pattern got buried under shame. And a pattern that is buried under shame does not get investigated. More women started falling apart. Their jaws, their spines, their hips. Catherine Schaub, who had worked at the plant as a teenager, developed a tumor. Quinta McDonald's hip failed and she could not walk. Grace Fryer's back began to collapse and her teeth started coming out. Doctors could not name it. Some suspected phosphorus from the match industry, where a similar jaw condition was known. In 1924, a dentist named Theodore Blum wrote about a case of this jaw destruction in a woman who painted watch dials, and he added, almost in passing, a phrase that ended up mattering enormously. He suggested it was connected to radium. He put it in a footnote. That footnote was read by a man named Harrison Martland. Hold that name. Here is where the company stops being unlucky and starts being culpable. By 1924, US Radium had a public problem. Their workers were dying and people were beginning to ask why. So they did something that looks, on the surface, responsible. They commissioned an independent study. They hired Cecil Drinker, an industrial hygiene specialist from Harvard, and his wife Catherine Drinker, a physician, and Cecil's colleagues, to come to the plant and investigate. The Drinkers came. They looked. And what they found appalled them. Radium dust was everywhere. On surfaces. In the air. On the workers. Cecil Drinker later described the dust as so pervasive it was on people's clothing and in their hair throughout the building. They tested workers and found abnormalities in the blood of a large proportion of them. And they wrote a report, and the report said plainly that the conditions in that plant were dangerous, and that the dial painters were being harmed, and that the lip-pointing practice had to stop. They gave that report to the company. The company did not stop the lip-pointing. Instead, US Radium's president wrote to the New Jersey Department of Labor. And he informed them that the investigation had found the plant to be in good condition. He sent them a version of the findings that said the opposite of what the Drinkers had concluded. The Drinkers found out. Catherine Drinker was, by every account, furious. Cecil Drinker eventually published their findings independently. And the fact that they did so is the reason we can compare the two versions at all. That is the single most important fact in this entire case. Not that women died. Not that the paint was dangerous. But that there existed, in 1924, a written, expert-commissioned warning. In the company's own filing cabinet. Paid for with the company's own money. And the plant kept running the same way for years after. And it gets worse, because they did not just suppress. They actively reassured. US Radium put forward a man named Frederick Flynn to examine the sick women. He held a doctorate, he worked at Columbia, and he presented himself in a way that led those women to believe they were being seen by a physician. He was not a medical doctor. He examined Grace Fryer and told her she was in as good health as he was. She was, at that moment, dissolving from the inside. Later, Flynn's own published work would end up contributing to the understanding of radium's danger, but at the moment it counted. When a young woman sat in front of him and asked whether she was sick, she was sent home and told she was fine. Now Harrison Martland enters, and this is where the story turns, because Martland did something nobody had thought to do. He stopped asking the women what was wrong with them. He started asking the radium. Martland was a pathologist, the chief medical examiner for Essex County, and he reasoned it out from first principles. Radium is chemically similar to calcium. The body cannot tell them apart. So the body files radium where it files calcium. In the bone. And once it is in the bone, it does not leave. It sits there, inside the marrow, inside the jaw, inside the spine, and it fires alpha and gamma radiation into the surrounding living tissue at point-blank range, day and night, for the rest of that person's life. Which is why the jaws failed first. The jaw takes constant microdamage from chewing, so it is constantly rebuilding itself, constantly pulling in calcium. And every time it reached for calcium, it grabbed radium instead. They were rebuilding their own jaws out of poison. So Martland designed tests. He measured the radioactivity of their exhaled breath. He captured the radon gas coming out of their lungs, gas produced by radium decaying inside their skeletons. He tested bone. He tested tissue. And he built something the law had never had before. A test that could prove, in a living human being, that a specific substance from a specific workplace was inside that person's body and was killing them. He could point at a woman and say, "The radium is in her. Here is the count." And when they exhumed Molly Maggia in 1927, 5 years dead, buried with a certificate that blamed her own morality for her death, Martland's approach was applied to her remains. Her bones were radioactive. Her jaw fragment exposed a photographic plate through black paper, in the dark, by itself. The word syphilis was finished. Because you cannot cross-examine physics. You cannot shame it. You cannot pay it. It does not care what is on the certificate. The radium was in her, and it had come from one place on Earth, and everyone knew the address. Grace Fryer decided to sue. It took her 2 years to find a lawyer who would take it. Think about that. 2 years, while her spine collapsed and she had to wear a steel back brace to stay upright. Eventually, a young attorney named Raymond Berry took the case. Grace was joined by 4 other women: Catherine Shaw, Quinta McDonald, Albina Larice, Edna Hussman. The newspapers gave them a name that stuck: the Radium Girls. And the company's defense was not, primarily, that radium was safe. Their strongest weapon was a calendar. New Jersey had a statute of limitations on occupational injury. You had to file within 2 years of exposure. But radium poisoning takes 5 years to surface. Sometimes 10. Sometimes 15. Which meant that under the law as written, by the time a dial painter could possibly know she had been injured, her right to sue had already expired. The disease was slower than the deadline. That was the argument. Not, "We did nothing wrong," but, "You are too late, and you were always going to be too late, and there was never a moment when you would not have been too late." And the delays kept coming. Hearings postponed. Dates pushed. Court schedules that stretched into months while the plaintiffs got visibly worse. At one point, none of the 5 could raise her arm high enough to take the oath. There were several of them, dying in public, in front of reporters, while the case was adjourned. And that turned out to be the thing the company could not survive. Because the press was there. And the photographs ran nationally. 5 young women, in their 20s, in braces and wheelchairs, waiting for a court date they might not live to see. In June of 1928, U.S. Radium settled. Each woman received $10,000. Plus $600 a year for as long as she lived, plus medical expenses. There was no admission of guilt. That is standard in a settlement, and it matters, so I will say it plainly. The company never accepted blame. But a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Workers had established that they could take an employer to court over an industrial disease and force it to pay. And there is one more thing about 1928. Sabin von Sochicki, the man who invented the paint, who believed in it, who had cut his own finger on radium-contaminated equipment years earlier and thought nothing of it. He died that November. Aplastic anemia. His bone marrow had stopped producing blood. He was killed by his own invention. And in the end, he had testified in support of the women. The inventor became evidence. Here is what most people do not know. New Jersey was not the end. It was the middle. Because at the same time, in Ottawa, Illinois, a company called Radium Dial was running the same operation. Same paint. Same brushes. Same instruction. Lip dip paint. And they had one advantage over US Radium. They had already seen what happened in New Jersey. Radium Dial tested their own workers in the mid-1920s. They collected the results. They did not tell the women what those results said. And when the New Jersey story hit the national papers and their workforce got frightened, the company took out an advertisement in the local newspaper, reassuring the town, telling the community that examinations had been done and nothing was wrong. The women read that advertisement, and they went back to work, and they put the brushes back in their mouths. Catherine Wolfe Donahue was one of them. She had been a dial painter since she was a teenager. By the mid-30s she was losing weight she could not afford to lose. Her hip was failing, and she was so light by the end that reports put her under 70 pounds. She sued Radium Dial. And this case is, in some ways, harder than New Jersey's, because Ottawa was a company town. Radium Dial was the employer. Neighbors turned on her. She was accused of trying to destroy the town's livelihood. Some people stopped speaking to her family. She sued anyway. In 1938, the hearing was held in her own house. Because she could not travel to the courtroom, she gave her testimony from her bed. At one point during those proceedings she collapsed and had to be carried out. She won. And then the company appealed. And she won again. And they appealed again. And again. The ruling in her favor was upheld through every level it was taken to. And in October of 1939 the United States Supreme Court declined to hear the company's final appeal. Catherine Donahue never knew that. She died in July of 1938, weeks after her victory in that bedroom. She won a case that outlived her by more than a year. Now the part one promised you at the beginning. In the 1940s, the United States started building nuclear weapons, and suddenly the government had thousands of workers handling radioactive material, and no idea how much was too much. There was no safe limit. Nobody had ever established one. There was no data on what internal radiation does to a human body over years, because you cannot run that experiment on people. Except it had already been run on a few hundred young women in New Jersey and Illinois who had swallowed measured quantities of radium, day after day, for years, and whose medical outcomes had been documented in extraordinary detail because they had gone to court and their bodies had become exhibits. The dial painters were the dataset. Their suffering became the human evidence base that informed radiation tolerance standards. The framework built partly on their cases fed into how the Manhattan Project protected its own people, and into the occupational limits that followed. Every radiographer with a dosimeter clipped to their coat. Every nuclear worker with an exposure log. Every hospital with a shielded X-ray room. That whole structure has these women underneath it. And the studies did not stop. For decades, researchers at Argonne National Laboratory tracked the surviving dial painters and, with consent, studied remains. They measured how much radium was still there. They followed the cancers. They built the dose-response curves that let us scientists say, with numbers, how much of this substance produces how much harm. Which brings me to the thing I said I would show you. When researchers exhumed and measured dial painters decades after death, the radium was still there. Still active. Still counting. Not a trace. Not a residue. A working, measurable source, doing in 1990 exactly what it had been doing in 1922. Because radium-226 has a half-life of about 1600 years. In 100 years, it has lost roughly 4% of its strength. 4%. The women are gone. The company that killed them is gone. The plant in Orange was torn out, and the site was declared a federal Superfund cleanup. The lawyers are gone. The judges are gone. Every person who stood in that Newark cemetery in 1927 is gone. The radium is not gone. It is in the ground in New Jersey, and in the ground in Illinois, and it will still be measurably radioactive in the year 3500. Grace Fryer's evidence has not expired. Catherine Donahue's evidence has not expired. The company got a statute of limitations. 2 years. That was the whole defense. Wait long enough and the claim dies. And the thing they poisoned these women with turned out to be the one witness in the case that cannot be outweighted. They chose a substance with a half-life of 1600 years, and then they argued in court that the clock had run out. It had not. It has barely started. They were told the paint would put color in their cheeks. They were told to put the brush between their lips. They were told, by a man in a white coat, that they were in as good health as he was. And there was a report in a filing cabinet the whole time that said otherwise. That is the story. Not the glow. Not the ghost girls at the dance hall. A document that existed, and a decision not to act on it. Everything you know about your right to be told what is in the room you work in comes from 5 women in Newark who could not lift their arms to take an oath, and 1 woman in Illinois who testified from a bed she never got out of. They are still there. Still glowing. Still on the record. If you want the next file, it is already up on the screen now, and it is about a man who was never identified for 74 years, until DNA gave him a name in 2022. And the name made the mystery worse. I will see you in that one.